Imagine for a moment that words are not just a means of communication, but a shield against death. Imagine that the act of storytelling, of weaving sentences one after another, is the only thread keeping you tied to existence while a sword hangs over your neck. This is not just a fantasy premise, it is the beating heart of one of humanity's most vast, complex, and fascinating works. Welcome to a journey through the infinite labyrinth of 1001 Nights, a work that has no single author, no single origin, and no single ending. Instead, it is a living organism that has breathed through the centuries, feeding on the voices of merchants, travelers, poets, and beggars from across the Orient. To understand this work, we must transport ourselves to an era where the boundary between the real and the fantastic was as thin as the blade of a scimitar. We find ourselves in the splendor of the Islamic Golden Age, primarily between the 8th and 13th centuries, although its roots reach much further back into ancient Persia and the oral traditions of India. Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus are the settings where these stories took shape, but their true homeland is the human imagination. The origin of this monumental compilation is itself a mystery worthy of one of its tales. There is no single original manuscript that we can point to as the definitive starting point. Instead, we have a palimpsest of cultures. The oldest core comes from a lost Persian book called 1000 Legends, which in turn adapted Indian fables. When these stories reached the Arabic world, they were transformed, expanded, and absorbed the vibrant urban life of the caliphates. Professional storytellers in the markets of Baghdad added layers of mischief, politics, eroticism, and theology, turning a simple collection of tales into a total mirror of the society of their time. It is fundamental to understand that 1001 Nights was not initially conceived as high literature for the elite, but as popular entertainment, giving it a freshness and a brutal honesty that is often lost in the more sanitized translations that reached the West centuries later. This organic nature leads us directly to the setup of its central conflict, the famous frame story that serves as the structure for everything else. It all begins with a wound of honor and a descent into madness. Sultan Shahryar, a powerful and initially just ruler, discovers his wife's infidelity. The impact of this betrayal not only breaks his heart but completely fractures his psyche. His reaction is an extreme manifestation of trauma and absolute power. Convinced that all women are inherently unfaithful, he decides to marry a young virgin from his kingdom every night only to execute her at dawn the next day. It is a cycle of systemic violence that plunges the country into terror and mourning. Here enters the figure of Scheherazade, the daughter of the vizier, who is not only a woman of great beauty but a first-rate intellectual. She has read the books of the ancients and knows history, philosophy, and the art of rhetoric. Scheherazade volunteers herself to the Sultan, not as a victim, but as a strategist of the word. Her plan is one of the most brilliant psychological maneuvers in universal narrative. Scheherazade begins to tell the Sultan a story during their first night together, but as dawn approaches, she stops at the most pivotal point of the tale, at the absolute climax, promising that the ending is even more extraordinary if she is allowed to live one more day. The Sultan, dominated by a curiosity that exceeds his bloodlust, postpones the execution. This process repeats night after night, month after month, year after year. What Scheherazade is doing is, in modern terms, a narrative therapy of prolonged exposure. She is not just gaining time, she is re-educating the Sultan's capacity for wonder and empathy through fiction. Each story is a mirror where the Sultan can see himself, his fears, and the possible consequences of his actions without the confrontation being direct. This structure leads us to explore the concept of the Chinese box or the frame narrative taken to its ultimate expression. Inside one story there is another, and inside that yet another, creating a sense of infinite depth. Narratology experts call this device mise en abîme, and in 1001 Nights, it functions as a hypnotic mechanism. The reader, like the Sultan, loses track of where reality ends and fantasy begins. This technique is not a simple ornament, but reflects a worldview where everything is interconnected. In these tales, a fisherman who finds a copper jar is not just finding an object, he is unlocking a chain of causality involving genies from the time of the Prophet Solomon, kings from distant lands, and inscrutable divine laws. If we delve deeper into the deconstruction of these tales, we find an analysis of the human condition that is surprisingly modern. Take, for example, the recurring presence of destiny, or maktub, which means it is written. In the philosophy of the work, destiny is an inescapable force, but it does not nullify human will, rather it challenges it. Characters often try to escape a prophecy, only to discover that their very efforts to flee are exactly what lead them to its fulfillment. This bears a direct relationship to Greek tragedy, but with an optimistic Oriental nuance where cunning and generosity can soften the blows of fortune. Wealth and poverty are transitory states, reflecting the instability of life on the desert trade routes. A man can be a prince today, a beggar tomorrow, and a vizier the day after, all depending on a chance encounter or an act of mercy. The psychology of the characters in this work is fascinating because it breaks away from flat archetypes. It is often thought that fairy tales have purely good or bad characters, but here morality is a terrain of shadows. The genies or jinns are beings of smokeless fire who possess free will. They are not simply lamps that grant wishes, they are entities with their own agendas, grudges, and religions. Some are pious followers of Islam, others are wicked rebels trapped as punishment. This complexity extends to humans. Aladdin, in his original version, is not the charismatic hero of animated films, but a lazy and somewhat selfish young man who must mature through suffering and loss. Sinbad the sailor does not travel for pleasure, but moved by an insatiable ambition and an existential restlessness that pushes him to risk his life time and again, despite having sworn never to go back to sea after each disaster. The role of women in 1001 Nights deserves a detailed analysis free from contemporary prejudices. Although the work was born in a patriarchal society, women are often the engines of action and the possessors of true wisdom. Scheherazade is the supreme example, but there are many others. Women who rescue their husbands, slave girls who surpass the caliph's scholars in knowledge, and villains of terrifying intelligence. The work recognizes that female power, when deprived of official channels of authority, manifests through wit, seduction, and the word. Another crucial aspect is the treatment of erotica and the body. Unlike the censored versions that circulated in Victorian Europe, the original text is of an astonishing frankness. Sexual desire is treated as a natural force, sometimes comic, sometimes tragic, but always present. There is no sharp separation between the sacred and the profane. A poem about the beauty of a face can precede a discussion on religious law. This tells us of a culture that, at its peak, integrated sensuality and spirituality in a way that is difficult for us to understand today. Pleasure is a divine gift and the body is a battlefield for the soul. But to understand this fully, we must look at the influence that religion and mystical thought have on the work. Although there are elements of pagan magic and popular superstition, the ethical framework is deeply Islamic. The idea of divine justice, the importance of hospitality, and the notion that knowledge is the most valuable treasure permeate every page. However, it is an Islam imbued with Sufism, the mystical branch that seeks direct union with the divine through poetry and ecstasy. Many tales function as Sufi parables, where the search for material treasure is actually a metaphor for the search for the inner self. Sinbad's journey, for example, can be read as the soul's path through the different stages of purification, facing the monsters of its own desires and fears. This inevitably leads us to another crucial aspect, the relationship between the work and historical reality. 1001 Nights is an invaluable source for historians because between flying carpets and magic lamps, precise details of daily life leak through. Diet, textiles, architecture, legal systems, and social hierarchies are described with vibrant realism. Caliph Harun al-Rashid, a real historical figure who ruled in the 9th century, becomes a mythical figure in the work who roams the streets of Baghdad disguised as a merchant to learn firsthand about the sorrows of his people. This device of the disguised king is not just a literary trope, but expresses the popular longing for a ruler who is truly human and accessible, a subtle critique of the isolation of the powerful in their ivory palaces. The evolution of the work toward modernity is an odyssey in itself. When the Frenchman Antoine Galland first translated a selection of these tales at the beginning of the 18th century, the impact on Europe was seismic. It was the birth of Orientalism, a mix of genuine fascination and exotic prejudices. It is curious to note that some of the most famous stories, like Aladdin or Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, were not in the original Arabic manuscripts Galland found. Apparently, they were narrated to him by a Maronite monk from Aleppo named Hanna Diab, and Galland incorporated them into his edition. This reinforces the idea that 1001 Nights is a border text, a bridge between cultures that is always under construction. As we move toward the analysis of its legacy, we see how this work has shaped the minds of giants of world literature. Jorge Luis Borges, the great Argentine writer, was obsessed with the notion of Night 602. According to some manuscripts, on that night, Scheherazade begins to tell the Sultan her own story, which is to say, she tells him the story of 1001 Nights. Borges saw in this device a reminder of our own finitude and the possibility that we ourselves are characters in someone else's dream. If characters in a book can be readers of that same book, then we, the readers, can be fictional. This metaphysical deconstruction is what elevates the work from being a simple collection of children's stories to being a philosophical treatise on the nature of reality. In the field of modern psychology, it has been studied how Scheherazade's structure resembles the cognitive processes of memory and survival. Narrative psychology suggests that human beings understand our lives not as a series of isolated facts, but as stories with meaning. When Scheherazade narrates, she is performing an act of healing. She is transforming the chaos of the Sultan's violence into the order of the story. This concept is applied today in therapies for trauma victims, where the patient must reconstruct their story to regain control over their own identity. Scheherazade not only saves her life, she saves the Sultan's humanity by reminding him that every person has a story that deserves to be heard. But to understand this fully, we must look at the connection with current technologies. We live in the era of the algorithm and the mass consumption of stories. Digital entertainment platforms today use the same technique that Scheherazade used 1,000 years ago, the cliffhanger or the hook at the end of the episode. The phenomenon of binge-watching series is nothing more than a modern version of the Sultan's thirst to know what happens next. However, there is a fundamental difference. Scheherazade told stories to preserve life, while the modern market often uses them to consume our time. The work invites us to reflect on the quality of the stories we consume and how they shape our perception of others. In an increasingly polarized world, Scheherazade's tales remind us that curiosity about the other is the antidote to cruelty. The relevance of this work in pop culture is immeasurable. From the music of Rimsky-Korsakov to Hollywood film adaptations and epic fantasy video games, the aesthetic of 1001 Nights has defined our vision of the Orient. But often this vision has been distorted by stereotypes that the work itself challenges. By returning to the original text, we discover a world much more diverse, cynical, wise, and less caricatured than movies have led us to believe. It is not just a world of friendly genies, it is a world of intense theological debates, of raw urban poverty, and of an intellectual sophistication that rivaled any culture in the world at that time. If we analyze the work from a neuroscience perspective, we can see how suspense and conflict resolution in the stories activate reward circuits in the brain. The dopamine released by anticipating the outcome of a story is what kept the Sultan awake and, by extension, kept Scheherazade alive. This leads us to think of storytelling as a biological necessity. We don't tell stories just for pleasure, but because our brain is designed to seek patterns and meanings in the chaos of existence. 1001 Nights is, in essence, a grand machine for generating meaning. But this flow of stories must lead us to a reflection on mortality. The great underlying theme of the work is time. 1001 Nights represent a number that symbolizes the infinite but has a limit. 1000 is a large number, but 1001 is a number that breaks the perfection of the round number and opens the door to the eternal. Scheherazade knows she cannot tell stories forever, but she hopes that when the nights end, the Sultan will have changed enough that he no longer needs the threat of death to feel alive. The work ends, in many versions, with the Sultan forgiving Scheherazade not because he has run out of stories, but because he has learned to love the storyteller and through her, all the women he previously despised. The word has conquered the sword. This leads us to consider how the work dialogues with modern problems of truth and fiction. In the era of fake news and media manipulation, 1001 Nights teaches us that fiction has real power over the physical world. A story can cause a war or bring peace. The storyteller's responsibility is therefore immense. Scheherazade uses her talent for the common good to stop a massacre. She challenges us to think about what stories we are telling today and whether those stories are serving to build bridges or to raise walls. The deep deconstruction of the text also reveals a critique of absolute power. Sultan Shahryar is the embodiment of the tyrant who has no one to tell him the truth. Only through fiction, which is a form of truth in disguise, can power be questioned. The tales in the work are full of cunning viziers who must correct the mistakes of their kings, of ordinary citizens who give morality lessons to the caliphs. It is a literature of resistance camouflaged under the mantle of fantasy. It teaches us that even in the most oppressive circumstances, intellect and creativity can find a crack through which to breathe and eventually topple tyranny. To understand this fully, we must look at the nature of the language itself. In Arabic, the word for tale or story is related to the act of healing. To narrate is to heal. When Scheherazade finishes her cycle, the entire kingdom has been transformed. The city that was previously plunged into silence and fear is once again filled with life. This is the definitive victory of culture over barbarism. The work tells us that a society that stops telling stories, or that only tells stories of hate, is doomed to self-destruction. Conversely, a society that embraces the multiplicity of voices, that lets itself be seduced by the complexity of the other, has a chance at redemption. Looking at the legacy of 1001 Nights in contemporary literature, it is impossible not to mention Latin American magical realism. Gabriel Garcia Marquez confessed that reading these tales opened his eyes to the possibility that the fantastic could be narrated with the same naturalness as the everyday. In 100 Years of Solitude, there is an echo of the cyclical structure and the atmosphere of wonder from Scheherazade's tales. The idea that time is not a straight line but a repeating circle is a profoundly oriental notion that has permeated all of modern literature. But to understand this fully, we must look at the concept of the human voice. In a world increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence and automatic content generation, the figure of Scheherazade takes on new relevance. She represents the uniqueness of human experience, the ability to improvise, to feel empathy, and to adapt the story to the listener's reactions. Artificial intelligence can process millions of data points and generate stories, but it lacks the vital urgency that Scheherazade has. She doesn't tell stories because she has been programmed to do so, but because her life depends on the emotional connection she manages to establish with another human being. This connection is what finally saves the world in the context of the work. It is not the gold in the thieves' caves, nor the power of the genies, but the ability of a man and a woman to sit down and talk and listen. In a philosophical sense, 1001 Nights is a monument to dialogue. It teaches us that violence is usually the result of a failure of communication, of an inability to imagine the suffering of others. By forcing the Sultan to listen to the stories of others, Scheherazade forces him to step out of his own wounded ego and recognize their shared humanity. Therefore, as we approach the end of this analysis, we must understand that 1001 Nights is not a closed book but an open invitation. Every time someone reads these tales or is inspired by them to create something new, Scheherazade wins one more night of life. The work challenges us to be the narrators of our own lives, not to accept the tragic endings that destiny seems to have imposed on us, and to always seek an extension through wit and kindness. The beauty of this book lies in its imperfection, in its contradictions, and in its inhuman scale. It is a forest where one can get lost forever and always find something new. It is a reminder that as long as there is a voice willing to tell and an ear willing to listen, there will be hope. The night may be dark and full of dangers, but dawn will always come, and with it, the possibility of a new story. We finally face the conclusion of this journey through the labyrinth of the words. 1001 Nights has taught us that art is not a luxury, but a tool for survival. That curiosity is stronger than fear, and that imagination is the only territory where we are truly free. Scheherazade, with her 1001 tales, not only defeated death, but left us a map to navigate the complexities of our own existence. Through kings, genies, merchants, and lovers, we see ourselves lost in the great market of life, always looking for that narrative thread that gives meaning to our passage through the world. This work will continue to resonate as long as humanity exists because it touches the deepest strings of our being, the desire for transcendence and the fear of being forgotten. At the end of the day, we are all Scheherazade telling stories so that the sun will rise again. And as long as those stories stay alive, as long as we continue to be amazed by the flight of a carpet or the cleverness of a young girl facing power, the spirit of Night 602 will continue to remind us that the end is only the beginning of another adventure. With this reflection on the transformative power of the word, we close this deep essay on the work that defied time and death, reminding you that the book of life always has one more page to write if we have the courage to keep narrating. Thank you very much for joining me on this extensive journey through the centuries and the sands of time.